They tell you the 1929 crash was a sudden accident, one bad day, one moment of panic. That's a lie. What really happened was far more dangerous. For years, everyone knew the system was fragile, and they chose to ignore it. Debt was exploding. People were gambling with borrowed money. Experts were saying this time is different. And when confidence finally cracked, it didn't just destroy Wall Street, it erased entire lives. Because here's the truth no one likes to admit: markets don't collapse when people are afraid, they collapse when people feel safe. And if you think that can't happen again, you're already part of the next bubble. The 1929 crash is often remembered as a sudden thunderclap, the moment the stock market fell from the sky and the Great Depression began. But history is almost never that simple. What happened on Wall Street in October 1929 wasn't just a bad day at the office. It wasn't merely punishment for greedy speculators. It was the end of a decade-long experiment in unrestrained optimism, a financial bubble inflated by debt leverage and blind faith in endless growth. When that bubble burst, the world was reminded of a hard truth. Confidence is a fragile currency, and once it evaporates, no central bank or politician can bring it back overnight. So let's strip away the panic and the myths. The crash wasn't a single day of chaos. It was a process, years of excess building toward a predictable breaking point. And if you think this is just an old story about ticker tape and top hats, think again. The very same ingredients are mixed into our financial system today: cheap money, speculative manias, inflated asset prices, and an entire culture that insists markets always go up. The real lesson of 1929 isn't how fast you can lose everything. It's how easily we convince ourselves the party will never end. The stage was set in the Roaring '20s, a decade of prosperity, consumerism, and technological wonder. America emerged from the First World War as the richest nation on earth. Industry boomed. Automobiles, radios, and refrigerators transformed everyday life. Cities expanded, wages rose, and millions of Americans bought into a vision of endless abundance. But behind the glamour, cracks were already forming. Farmers were drowning in debt as crop prices collapsed. Wealth became increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small industrial elite, leaving most households with little protection if hard times arrived. And banks, lightly regulated and often reckless, were lending freely to anyone who wanted a piece of the action. The stock market became the great playground of the 1920s. Between 1921 and 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average exploded from 63 points to 381, a six-fold increase in just 8 years. Ordinary people, not just Wall Street insiders, rushed in. For the first time, millions of middle-class Americans became investors, convinced they were witnessing the birth of a new economic era. Brokerage houses opened offices across the country. Financial newspapers and radio shows fueled the frenzy, promising riches to anyone bold enough to borrow and buy. And borrow they did. Margin trading, borrowing money to buy stocks, became the defining feature of the bubble. Investors would put down just 10% in cash and borrow the rest. With $1,000, you could control $10,000 worth of stock. As long as prices rose, leverage magnified profits. But the moment prices dipped, brokers issued margin calls, forcing investors to either add cash or sell immediately. This created a time bomb. The higher the market climbed, the more fragile it became. One stumble, and an entire pyramid would collapse under the weight of forced selling. Even leaders and economists fed the illusion. In early 1929, Charles E. Mitchell, head of National City Bank, insisted there was nothing to fear. President Herbert Hoover promised a chicken in every pot, a car in every garage. And just days before the crash, the famous economist Irving Fisher declared that stock prices had reached a permanently high plateau. These weren't fools. They were some of the brightest minds of their generation. But intelligence is no defense against collective euphoria. When a system rewards optimism and punishes caution, even experts become cheerleaders for the bubble. The warning signs were there. By 1928, the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates to cool speculation, but it was too little, too late. Credit had already flooded the system. In September 1929, The market peaked, and small cracks began to appear. A handful of large investors quietly sold their positions, sensing trouble ahead. Then, in late October, the dam finally broke. On October 24th, Black Thursday, panic selling erupted. A record 12.9 million shares were traded in a single day. Banks and major institutions pooled money to buy stocks and restore confidence. For a moment, it worked, but only for a moment. On Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday, panic returned with vengeance. More than 16 million shares changed hands. Ticker tape machines lagged hours behind reality. Fortunes vanished in a single afternoon. The myth of endless prosperity died in real time. But here's the crucial truth. The crash itself didn't cause the Great Depression. It was the spark, not the fire. The deeper catastrophe came from fragility of the financial system and the disastrous policy choices that followed. Banks had lent recklessly, often without sufficient reserves. When loans failed, banks collapsed. Between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 U.S. banks failed. Millions of people lost their life savings overnight. With credit frozen, businesses couldn't borrow. Production collapsed. Unemployment surged to 25%. Global trade shrank as nations turned inward, erecting tariffs and protectionist barriers. What began as a financial crisis metastasized into a worldwide economic depression. And the most haunting part? It wasn't inevitable. The disaster was a result of decisions. Weak regulation, unchecked speculation, blind faith in growth, and failure to act decisively when warning signs appeared. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was man-made and preventable. The illusion of prosperity shattered completely. Between 1929 and 1932, the stock market lost nearly 90% of its value. The Dow collapsed from 381 points to just 41. An entire generation watched their savings, pensions, and investment evaporate. Families who borrowed heavily during the boom were crushed by debt once prices collapsed. Even cautious savers suffered because when banks failed, deposits vanished. There was no federal insurance, no safety net. If your bank failed, your financial freedom disappeared with it. Governments then made things worse. In 1930, the United States passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, raising import taxes to protect domestic industry. Other countries retaliated, and global trade collapsed by 2/3 within 4 years. At the same time, leaders clung to the gold standard, believing currency confidence required rigid gold backing. Instead, it forced governments to tighten policy when stimulation was desperately needed. Countries that abandoned gold early, like Britain in 1931, recovered sooner. The United States waited until 1933 and paid the price. By the mid-1930s, the Depression reshaped the world. In Germany, economic despair fueled extremism, opening the door for Adolf Hitler. In America, Franklin Roosevelt launched the New Deal, public works, banking reform, and social safety nets designed to rebuild trust. The SEC was created to regulate markets. The FDIC was established to ensure bank deposits. These weren't bureaucratic tweaks. They were desperate attempts to restore faith in a system that had utterly failed ordinary people. The lesson was brutal but clear. Without confidence and without rules that protect savers, capitalism devours itself. So, why does this still matter today? Because the mechanisms behind the 1929 crash never disappeared. They live inside human nature. Every bubble since has followed the same script. Dot-com stocks in the 1990s, housing in 2008, speculative assets today. The details change: tulips, railroads, tech stocks, crypto, but the cycle remains. Easy credit, speculative frenzy, collapse, scapegoats. The same phrases repeat every time. This time is different. We've reached a permanently high plateau. The fundamentals are strong. These are not reassurances. They are warning signs. Look at today's markets. Years of ultra-low interest rates and central bank intervention have inflated asset prices. Trillions in debt weigh on governments, corporations, and households. New speculative playgrounds emerge constantly. And just like in 1929, millions of people believe the system will protect them. History tells a colder story. When confidence breaks, protection vanishes, and those at the bottom suffer first. The real lesson of 1929 isn't panic, it's resilience. Those who diversified, who avoided excessive leverage, who understood boom and bust cycles survived. Those who chased easy profits, borrowed recklessly, and trusted fragile systems were destroyed. That dynamic never changes. So ask yourself this: if the system wobbled tomorrow, if markets have, credit froze, or bank accounts were restricted, how prepared would you be? Would you be the margin trader of 1929, waiting for one margin call to erase everything? Or the investor who understands that real wealth isn't paper promises, but durable value? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with cruel consistency. The 1929 crash, explained without panic, isn't just a chapter in economic history. It's a mirror. So don't worship markets. Don't confuse speculation with wealth. Protect yourself with knowledge, discipline, and realism, because the system is not designed to save you when things go wrong. And they always do. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.